everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Kitabi Karwan Podcast. In today's podcast, I'm actually going to talk about another question that was asked to me via an Instagram DM, which asked me about how do I read as fast as I do. Uh, a huge disclaimer before I answer this question: I don't think I read too fast or too quickly, for that matter. But I do understand that my general reading speed appears to be fast for most people who do not read, right, in general, or read less. That being said, before I start, I'd just like to mention I've read about 26 books this year, which is roughly half at my target of reading one book a week. And so, yeah, this podcast is going to be very quick and very small, and it's going to talk about some of the tips that I can give about how to read more books. And this is not just about reading quickly or reading more books, but it's also about how to kind of constantly keep in touch with your hobby of reading. So the very first thing that I did to improve my reading or increase my reading speed is I started making sure that I am around books all the time, right? So that's step one. Make sure you're around books all the time. What do I mean by that? Take really small steps, but always ensure that a book is always within a hand's reach. So you need to have a book by your bedside for sure. You need to have a book on your table, on your bag. Make sure your phone's home screen has the Kindle and the Apple Books or whatever reading app that you use on the home screen with like a bunch of books available on it, right? Or you're carrying your Kindle with you wherever you're going. Make sure you have Audible installed on your phone so that you can listen to audiobooks or whatever if it suits you. The idea being that at any given moment, however lazy that you are, you can always end up reading a book, right? So you're lying in bed before you sleep for an hour, you kind of have want to do something, you can pick up a book without getting up from your bed. Breaking that obstacle becomes a very, very important part of ensuring that you read more, because honestly, it's going to boil down to this. It's 11 in the night, you have an hour to read before you sleep, right? But the book is all the way across the room on the table and not by your bedside. You probably would end up wasting time on Instagram or on YouTube or watching something on Netflix. But if it's at the same distance as your phone is, right, you will end up picking up the book. And the moment you pick up the book, half the battle's won, right? So that's step one. Always make sure you're around books. Step number two is that works for me personally is I always juggle between a few books at the same time. So I know a lot of people who like to read just one book at a time, right? They don't read anything else before they finish that book. And if that works for them, that's great. But what I've realized is that the human mind always wants different things at different points of time. When you're really, really tired after a day of, say, at work or after a day of studying, you don't really want to read a non-fiction book. And the exact opposite can also happen when you just, super fresh and you have a lot of time on your hand and you're kind of serious about things. You don't really want to read a fantasy book at that point of time, right? Or for that matter, when I come to my third point, I would come back to to this, that sometimes you just don't want to read. You might want to consume your book through an audio format, right? And that's completely fine too. So what personally works for me is that I try and have four books at the time. One as a fiction book, a non-fiction book, a book on Audible or as an audiobook, and one as a PDF on my laptop, so that whenever I'm studying or when I need to take a quick break, I can read something, right? So that brings me to my third point, that is, don't be afraid to experiment with formats. Again, this is something that purists would debate on, whether reading an ebook is the same as reading a book, or whether listening to an audiobook is the same as a book or not. What's the experience of reading a paperback? And again, I do get it, right? I love reading a paperback, and whenever I can, I try and buy an actual book. But at the end of the day, if your goal is to maximize your reading, you need to adapt to different formats and consume knowledge in that way. So for example, when I'm working out or when I'm just about to fall asleep, I turn on my audiobook, right? So I turn off the lights when I'm sleeping, or when I'm working out. I can't really read a book then, but I can listen to an audiobook. Or for that matter, when I'm browsing something on my computer or I have some time to kill before I have to do something else, I can just quickly read a PDF and get back to it. That is something you should keep in mind instead of shutting off the possibilities of experimenting with different formats. Uh, the next tip that I think I can offer is that if you have fallen into a routine where you end up not reading books, right? The best possible way is to schedule time for reading books. So you set it around like half an hour a day to read a book, or you set around an hour a day to read a book, whatever fits your schedule as per your convenience, right? But make sure you do follow it for at least a few days so that your body or your mind gets used to the fact that, okay, this is reading time, this is the time when you will be consuming knowledge by reading a book or just consuming something, some form of entertainment, right? And this becomes important because I found that a lot of people struggle with the idea of reading on a continuous basis. For them, it's just one of those things such as meditation or learning a language or learning a new instrument or like any other new year resolution that you do for a few days and you completely forget. So the same way that you make a habit out of things is the same way you have to apply the same thought to reading, right? Make sure you have a slot for reading in your schedule. And once, obviously, it's not that if you don't want to read throughout the day, you shouldn't. But come what may, in that small slot, it can be as small as 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, you're going to read something. You can make it a number based goal. You're going to read 10 pages a day or 20 pages a day, but you need to pencil that in somewhere, right? Ideally, try and do it before some major activity, right? Like right before you fall asleep, you'll read for an hour, or read 10 pages before you sleep, or you'll read 10 pages the first thing in the morning, because these are things that are going to build up towards it. Um, Another thing that could probably help, which somewhat worked for me but not quite a lot, is tracking my reading, and that too in a public manner, right? So, something that a lot of uh, famous people do is that they publicize their goal, and they publicize it to such an extent that failure would be embarrassing for them and much worse than giving up. So, for example, Mark Zuckerberg, when he started off Facebook, he just made some visiting cards. This is an anecdote. I'm not too sure if it's a true story, but he made visiting cards which wrote that CEO of $1 billion company, and he just distributed it among friends, right? So unless he achieved that goal sometime in the future, his friends would end up making fun of him, and that being the driving factor behind him doing it. That was the anecdote. I'm sure that wasn't the entire story, but you do get the point that I'm trying to make. That the moment you start publicizing your goal or even just tracking your goal, it gives you a sense of a satisfaction when you achieve that goal, and b a sense of drive when you have to achieve that goal. Personally, I use Goodreads to track what I'm reading right now, what percentage of the book I'm done with, and it just gives me a quick, I don't know, feel good feeling when I see that, oh, I'm done with 50% of a really thick book, or I'm almost done with a book, so I might as well kind of finish it off the next day. And that is one of those driving factors. So you could possibly try posting on your social media about it, maybe a bookstagram if you're really into it, right, where you can just document your this thing. Or you could join a reading challenge where you've been giving where you are given reading prompts or reading challenges. So Reddit has a beautiful thread on it. There is a Pop Sugar challenge that happens online. Different magazines have challenges. Goodreads has its own challenge, right? Where you can challenge yourself to read a certain amount of books or read a particular kind of books. And if you're always, if you need recommendation, you can always just DM Kitabi Karwan and you can ask us for recommendation, and we'll be back with it. So yeah, that's all I have, I think, on how to read more books, or how to read a lot more books for that matter. And I would urge you to check out other bookstagrammers or other readers who read far, far more than I do. I'm just at a measly 26 books this year. I know for a fact there are a bunch of people who've read roughly 50, 60 books a year, which boils down to about 2 books a week, which is really fascinating. And I think that involves a lot of other skills and a lot of other tips, which I think would be really helpful for you. But speaking as an ordinary reader, I think this is more than enough. And just a disclaimer at the end, right? Um, do not measure yourself by the number of books you can read in a particular period of time. That's not what the act of reading is about. Reading is about enjoying the activity, enjoying the act of reading the written word, right? So it doesn't matter if you read one book in a month or whether you read one book in a day. as long as you're deriving the maximum that you can from that book, whether it's knowledge, whether it's pleasure, whether it's entertainment, whether it's just inspiration, I don't know, anything that you get out of it, the time in which you read the book really doesn't matter. It's a very different question when you're talking about speed reading or trying to improve your reading speed for a particular purpose, for an examination or for professional purposes where you need to have a certain reading speed. That's a completely different thing, because there you're doing it for a very set purpose in life. Reading in general has a much broader form of kind of relating to you, and I think that's something all of you should remember. So don't pressurize yourself to read more, but if you're at any point of time really want to kind of read a lot more books, these are some tips that will help you. Stay tuned and hit like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Thank you.